Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Poll 205 Women in Politics. This week, we're discussing the gender gap. In this week's lecture, we're going to introduce a lot of really important terms that we're going to keep coming back to throughout the semester, such as what is the gender gap? What is intersectionality? We're going to talk about how the gender gap manifests intersectionally through things like partisan identification or which party individuals associate themselves with. We're going to talk about vote choice. We're going to talk about how different subgroups of women's voting behavior has changed over the last few elections. And then towards the end of the lecture, we're going to discuss some of the facts and myths surrounding the gender pay gap. After you complete this video lecture, you'll be directed to watch one of my older lectures that goes through these points in detail. And then finally, we're going to wrap up this lecture by talking about a very important concept known as the feminization of poverty. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So when we're referring to the gender gap, what we're talking about are gender-based differences in public opinion, party preference, and vote choice. And since about the 1980s, we've seen a very consistent trend in women having slightly higher turnout than men. So in this week's lecture, we're going to be looking at a lot of data like this that shows us trend lines between how women participate in politics, how men participate in politics, and you will notice this very consistent gap between how women participate in politics versus men. And that, in essence, is what we're referring to when we talk about the gender gap. Now, a really important component of this lecture and the class at large, really, is talking about how these differences in gender manifest through an intersectional lens. And in this class and other classes, when you hear the word intersectional being used, what we're talking about is a framework for understanding how race, class, gender, and ability intersect to create varying degrees of privilege and discrimination. So looking at how men and women's voting behavior varies by their racial identity is a really great example of these intersectional identities. Here we're looking at the intersection of gender and race with respect to voting behavior. And there's lots of really intriguing information that we can gain from looking at this graphic here. First, we could look at the y-axis and examine how the percentage of individuals voting differs by racial subgroup. For instance, when we look at the white category here, we see the highest voter turnout among all other racial subgroups. So one question we might ask ourselves is, why is voter turnout so much higher for white voters compared to other racial subgroups? Another thing that we could look at are the differences between men and women in each of these racial subgroups. With the exception of the Asian racial subgroup category, where we don't see very much variation at all, when we look at the white subgroup, the black subgroup, and the Hispanic subgroup, in each of those categories, we see that women turn out or vote at higher rates than do their male counterparts. So lots of interesting questions here. Why are white voters so much more likely to turn out? Why do we see, kind of regardless of racial subgroup, that women are much more likely to turn out than men? These are some of the questions that we're going to attempt to answer in this lecture and things that I want you discussing in this week's discussion board. But when we're talking about intersectional identities, we don't just have to be talking about race or gender. We can introduce other socioeconomic factors, such as educational attainment, for instance. So here we're looking at the same voter turnout data, but instead of looking at the gender difference by race, now we're looking at this through the intersectional lens of educational attainment. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that we would expect to see, right? As education levels increase, you're probably more in tune to politics. You probably have a deeper understanding of what's happening politically, and you feel more engaged in that process. So individuals with low levels of education, we don't really see them participating much in politics. However, when we look at individuals with a bachelor's degree or more, we see that nearly 3/4 of those individuals are turning out to vote on election day. Education is generally one of the biggest predictors of political engagement in American politics. So when we're thinking about why certain types of people, again, based on race, based on gender, why are they more or less likely to participate in politics? One question that we should ask ourselves is, well, do these individuals from different groups have the same access to education as individuals from other groups? And if the answer to that question is no, then we start gaining a really comprehensive picture of why some individuals participate in politics much more than other individuals. Another intriguing aspect of the gender gap is how men and women associate with different political parties. Again, we generally refer to this as partisan identification. Just looking at this graph here, we can see that the gap in women's partisan identification is much more skewed towards the Democratic Party, whereas men are more evenly split between whether they vote for Republican or Democratic candidates. And this is not just a pattern that we see among older voters. In fact, some argue that the gender divide is even stronger among younger voters or Gen Z. According to the Survey Center on American Life, we can see that young women or women in Gen Z are much more likely to identify with the Democratic Party than are young men. Moreover, we can see that only about 20% of young women identify with the Republican Party, whereas young men, more than a third, identify with the Republican Party. So we see continued gender gap here with respect to partisan identification, even among America's newest cohort of voters. So I want to introduce our first stop and think right about here. I want you to think about why women are significantly more likely than men to vote and identify with the Democratic Party. And in answering this question, before we get into the lecture content, I want you to try to think about what are the fundamental differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party right now, and why might some women be more drawn to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So I want you to stop, think, catalog your initial thoughts to this question, and I want you to see how your answers stack up with the rest of the content that we'll discuss in this lecture. So go ahead and pause, write down your answers before proceeding with the video. So in this class, I do want to make sure that I'm giving you a really basic, broad introduction to some of the fundamentals of American politics. And in doing so, I want to begin by introducing what are the key foundational differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in this country. So this is going to be a really broad oversimplification about what Democrats stand for and what Republicans stand for. We're going to expand upon this in more detail throughout the semester and make these nuances a little bit clearer. But just for today's lecture, if you're not super familiar with the major ideological differences between the two major parties, that's what this slide is for here. Let's start with the Democratic Party. So first, one of the biggest policy agendas of the Democratic Party is this idea of the redistribution of wealth. You've probably heard this repeated by various politicians on social media or in interviews or in speeches, that the 1% of this country has too much wealth, right? And this idea that it should be the government's responsibility to provide for its citizens. And one way that the government can do that is by taking resources from individuals who have excess, right? Generally economic excess, and redistributing that to individuals who have less resources. So when we're talking about the redistribution of wealth, right, we're talking about something you might have heard referred to as entitlement programs, right? Social security, unemployment benefits, food stamps, things like that. Taking wealth from other individuals and giving it to the needy. That's generally a big platform of the Democratic Party. Together, this means that the Democratic Party really favors this value of collectivism, that we are stronger when we all work together, and it is society's responsibility to uplift the American collective together. The Democratic Party also generally favors higher taxes, particularly on the wealthy, because we have to find ways to pay for these programs that help the neediest individuals in our society. That translates to higher taxes. When we're talking about big big government versus small government. More government services means a larger government. So when you hear individuals say, we need to make government bigger, what individuals are really saying is that we need more social programs out there to help the general public. This is a big aspect of the Democratic Party platform as well. And then lastly, the Democratic Party generally favors policies that promote social progressiveness. So when we're talking about policies that promote social progressivism, we're generally talking about policies that expand individuals' access to certain services or expand individuals' rights and privileges. We are talking about promoting ideas that support cultural innovation and change. Now let's switch to the Republican Party briefly. And because we have this two-party system, generally the parties take pretty opposite viewpoints of each other. So if the Democratic Party favors a redistribution of wealth, we know that the Republican Party is going to favor more laissez-faire economics, which essentially refers to economic policies in which the government takes a very hands-off approach to economic regulation. So while the Republican Party certainly favors some degree of wealth redistribution, for instance, many Republicans are generally very supportive of Social Security and retirement benefits, generally the Republican Party is much more laissez-faire, that the government should play a very minimal role in regulating wealth and regulating the economy. This in turn leads many Republicans to favor individualism, and that it's not necessarily the government that should be so interested in protecting the collective and making sure that everyone in society has what they need to be successful, but rather there is some degree of individual accountability. If you want to do well in this country, you have to work hard. A common messaging tactic that you will hear from Republicans or conservative ideology is that individuals should not expect a government handout. Republicans also generally advocate for tax breaks for the wealthy, the idea being here that it is the wealthiest individuals and businessmen and entrepreneurs in our society that are job creators and job innovators, and that too much government regulation inhibits these individuals from creating jobs for the rest of Americans. Republicans also generally favor smaller government or less services. Again, it should not be the government's responsibility to make sure that everybody has every tool they need to be successful. There is some degree of personal accountability here. And then finally, Republicans also tend to favor policies that promote traditionalism. And a lot of this just boils down to a particular worldview that really differentiates the two parties from each other. And we're going to get into this in a lot more detail about, why is it that Republicans tend to be more traditional in their worldview? Why are Democrats more progressive? We're going to get into the nuance of that later in the semester. But for now, this is a really solid starting point for understanding the major ideological differences between the two parties. So going through these, maybe you're now starting to get a better idea of understanding why is it that women may be more drawn to the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. And to really contextualize these differences, I want to share with you a little bit of exit poll data. So exit polls generally occur on election day after individuals have voted. They're leaving the voting precinct, they're getting on their way back to their cars to carry on with their day. And generally a reporter or a researcher or a social scientist may be outside of one of those polling precincts and will ask people to stop for a moment to discuss who they voted for, why they voted for them. And those individuals will also, these researchers will collect important demographic information about these voters. So they'll ask them, what is their age? Is this their first time voting? What's their race? What's their gender? And that's where we get all of this really cool data from. Now, as you remember, right, we were kind of on lockdown in 2020 during our last presidential election, so we don't have a ton of reliable exit poll data from the 2020 presidential election because so many states allowed individuals to vote by mail. People weren't going out to their voting precinct to cast their ballot. So the ability to stand outside of voting precincts and collect exit poll data wasn't really an option. So that's why we're going to return to 2016, the last presidential election where we have reliable exit poll data. And here I want to talk about how women voted during this really pivotal election between Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, and Hillary Clinton, the first woman to ever be nominated by a major political party. And what we're about to do here is take a really intersectional approach to examining how different types of women voted during this election. So I'm going to tell you what the categories are, before they come up on the screen, and I want you to think about, okay, what percentage do you think were most likely to vote for, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate, or the Republican candidate? Maybe the results might shock you. So the first thing that we're going to look at is just how women voted. So I want you to think, out of all of the women voters in 2016, what percentage of them do you think voted for Hillary Clinton? So according to exit poll data from 2016, approximately 54% of all women voters cast their ballot for Hillary Clinton, compared to about 42% of women who supported Trump. So this is pretty much in line with all of the data that we've been looking at throughout this lecture already. Women tend to vote with the Democratic candidate. But now let's pull in some of those intersectional identities. The next graph I'm going to show you is how college-educated white women voted. And I want you to think, is the number going to increase or is it going to decrease? When we incorporate educational status, we actually see that the division tightens a bit. 44% of white women with a college education voted for Trump. 51% of white women with a college education voted for Hillary Clinton. This is a really intriguing pattern that's been changing slowly throughout American politics. White women with college degrees used to overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. Now there is much more competition between the Republican and Democratic candidate when it comes to this really important demographic. Now, what about unmarried women? If I asked you, how do you think unmarried women voted in 2016? What do you think that we would see? Well, marital status is a pretty big predictor of how young women vote. According to 2016 exit poll data, about 63% of all unmarried women supported Hillary Clinton, compared to a very drastically small 32% of unmarried women who voted for Trump. And these are all kinds of questions I want you exploring in the discussion board with your peers. What is it about unmarried women that you think explains why they overwhelmingly supported the Democratic candidate? Does it have something to do with age? Does it have something to do with values? What do you think? What do you think explains why marital status here would be such an important predictor of how people vote, particularly women, right? Next, we're going to look at some racial subcategories of women and examine how they voted. So keep in mind, the first graph that we looked at was how all women voters cast their ballot in 2016. We saw that 54% of all women voted for Hillary Clinton. But now, if we were just to focus on Hispanic women, what do you think that we will see? Do you think that we will find more support for the Democratic candidate or less support? And kind of think about why you think we might see those results go in one direction or the other. So, are these the results that you were expecting? Again, according to 2016 data, about 70% of Hispanic women cast their ballot for Hillary Clinton, compared to only about a quarter of Hispanic women who voted for Donald Trump. Why do you think that Hispanic women are so much more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump? The next graphic I'm going to show you is how Black women voted in 2016. Again, do you think that Black women were more or less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton? Here we see that 94% of Black women supported Hillary Clinton, compared to only about 3% of Black women who supported Trump. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Black voters in this nation are generally so supportive of the Democratic Party. We're going to get to that throughout this course, but just for today, I want you thinking about, why do you think we see this overwhelming solidarity, particularly among Black women voters and their allegiance towards the Democratic Party? What factors do you think explain that level of party allegiance and loyalty? And then our final category, we're going to look at white women. How did white women vote in 2016? Again, do you think they were more or less supportive of Hillary Clinton? And what's really intriguing about how white women voted in 2016 is that this was the only racial subgroup of women who were more likely to vote for Donald Trump at 52%, compared to 43% of white women who voted for Hillary Clinton. And this kind of defies the odds of everything that we've been looking at in this lecture. I mean, we've looked at data that goes all the way back to the 1980s. We see that women have traditionally gravitated towards the Democratic Party. When we look at racial subgroups, we see that racial minorities overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party. But it wasn't until 2016 that we saw a really drastic shift of white women beginning to leave the Democratic Party and instead favoring Republican Party policies in greater magnitude. And why do you think this is? Why are white women increasingly identifying with the Republican Party? Well, there's a few answers I'd like to offer. First, we can interpret this shift of white women leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party as really a backlash to radical feminism. So when we recall the type of things that second wave and third wave feminism were advocating for, we know that there was a much greater emphasis on intersectionality. That first wave feminism had been critiqued for being too white, too affluent, and really unrelatable and exclusionary. So one thing that explains why white women in particular are moving away from the Democratic Party, moving away from labeling themselves as feminists, is because they no longer see it as a movement that really resonates with them, their values, or their issues. Again, as these social movements prioritize talking about issues that affect minority cultures, white women see less of a space for themselves, their issues, and their identity in these social movements. This is further illustrated by the point that linked fate attitudes are becoming much less common among white women in particular. And if you've never heard this term before, when we're talking about linked fate, basically what we're talking about is the feeling that what happens to someone in my group has the potential to shape my own life directly. And I want to show you some examples of what we're talking about here. Linked fate is just another way of thinking about how connected we feel to other people who share our same intersectional identities. So here we're looking at data about how connected women feel to other women based upon their political leaning. So here looking at this graph, we see how connected conservative women feel to other women, how connected moderate women feel to other women, liberal women, very liberal women, etc. And so looking at this data here, right, we see that women who identify as very liberal, about a quarter of them feel very connected to other women. This is in stark juxtaposition to conservative women. Only about 8% of women who identify as politically conservative feel connected to other women. And again, a lot of this has to do with how the different political parties conceptualize the role of society and government. We know that conservatives generally emphasize the value of individualism, that if there's a problem in your life, you should do something about it. Take personal accountability. Whereas Democrats very much believe that the government should primarily be a safety net, that the point of living in a society and the point of having a government is that we can pool together our resources and take care of those who are most in need. So it's not necessarily surprising as we become much more polarized and these attitudes become much more central to our identity as Americans and our values, that liberal women feel more connected to other women, whereas conservative women do not possess those same attitudes. In other words, the sense of linked fate, what happens to other women has the potential to happen to me as well. We don't see that attitude resonating with conservative women like we do liberal women. Now, among social scientists, linked fate is generally studied most through a racial lens. So here we see a question from Pew Research. What happens to people from their own racial or ethnic group in the country overall affects what happens in their own life. What percentage of people agreed with that statement based upon their racial identity? Only about 23% of white respondents believe that what happens to people from their own racial group overall affects what happens in their own life. So there's some really fascinating patterns that emerge when we look at this data. Looking at white respondents, Hispanic respondents, and Asian respondents, when asked what happens to people from their own racial or ethnic group in the country overall affects what happens in their own life, only about 23 to 28% of respondents from each of those racial subgroups said, yes, That happens a lot. What happens to people from my racial group overall affects what happens in my own life a lot. So only about a fifth of respondents from these racial subcategories agreeing with that statement. However, Black respondents answer this question much, much differently. Nearly twice as many Black respondents believe that what happens to people from their own racial group has the propensity to impact their personal lives quite a lot. That's almost half of all respondents in the Black racial subgroup category. And this isn't necessarily surprising, right? Considering the way that we talk about bias and discrimination and inequity in political structures, social structures, systemic structures, that Black individuals feel a much stronger sense of linked fate than do other racial subgroups in this country. So hopefully this example of linked fate helps you understand the power of identity in American politics, and the groups that we belong to and the identities that we express has a really significant impact on how we perceive the world around us and how that influences the way we participate with and interact with government. And throughout this class, we're going to continue to investigate the ways in which the gender gap manifests intersectionally or across categories such as race and class. For instance, you've probably heard the statistic a million times that women make 83 cents for every dollar a man makes. You may have even heard of something called Equal Pay Day, which occurs every year on March 15th, which represents how far the average woman must work into the year to catch up to men's average pay from the year previous. But what people are sometimes less aware of is how much worse the gender gap becomes when we account for other intersectional identities like race. Asian American and Pacific Islander women don't catch up with men's pay from the year previous until May 3rd. LGBTQ plus individuals catch up on June 15th. Working moms catch up on September 8th. Black women catch up on September 21st. Native women catch up on November 30th. And Latinas catch up on December 8th, almost a full year later. In this class, we're going to spend a lot of time not only investigating how the gender gap manifests across all these other areas of life, society, and politics, but we're also going to pay particular attention to the intersectional nuances of these power inequities as well. Because through this approach, we are able to understand how these differences result in broad systemic or system-level inequality. And one example of systemic gender pay inequality is this concept known as the feminization of poverty. The feminization of poverty refers to the trend of increasing economic inequality between men and women. Differences in childhood socialization, societal expectations, gender stereotypes, as well as cultural norms, not only between countries and regions, but also between race and ethnicity, can exacerbate the feminization of poverty. If we were to just look at census data between men and women, we would see that about 11% of women in the United States live in poverty, compared to about 9% of men. And with only a 2% difference, we might not think that the gap is very severe, but when we examine poverty at an intersectional level, the gaps are shockingly evident and concerning. In every single race-based category, we see that women are significantly more likely than their male counterparts to live in poverty. Moreover, we see some racial groups are much more likely to experience poverty than others. And this isn't even a problem that's unique to the United States. In fact, when we look at some of the most economically developed countries in the world, we see this pattern repeat itself over and over and over. Women globally are more likely than men to live in poverty. So while we're going to be discussing these issues through an American lens, I want you to understand that these are global issues. These are not uniquely American problems, which means that their solutions are not uniquely American either. And in the next lecture, we're going to break down some of the myths and facts about why the gender pay gap exists and what do we do about it. So that's it for this introductory lecture. Don't forget to watch the next lecture. Again, that lecture is a little bit older, but I think the information is still pretty relevant and up to date. That's all I have for you in this lecture. I hope you enjoyed. I look forward to reading your discussion board posts. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.